Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I'm going to do a brief review of another Phantom Detective pulp novel, and this is the first that I've read in the Adventure House reprints. As far as I know, Adventure House has the most complete run of trying to reprint all of the Phantom Detective novels, but they also basically reprint the contents of the magazine down to the backup stories and the advertisements. So it's a really nice experience to be able to read a recreation of a pulp magazine and not have to pay a super premium price. The Adventure House reprints are on the affordable side. But to my knowledge, they're the only publisher to do almost the entire run of the Phantom Detective, which is incredibly important, but also a bit daunting because the character is probably the longest running of the pulp heroes in terms of not necessarily the number of issues, but the actual lifespan of the character, which started in 1933 as an attempt to have a competition for the legendary success of The Shadow in 1931. Which is really what spawned the sort of hero industry of the pulp magazines that dominated newsstands in the 1930s. So basically every different publisher tried to come up with their own, if not Shadow knockoff or Shadow clone, their own character or vigilante character to at least compete with the success of Street and Smith's The Shadow. But the Phantom Detective lasted about 20 years, with the last issues coming out in 1953 in terms of the pulp magazine. But like a lot of the other big characters, he made the transition to, of course, comics and even radio versions as well. Now, as I discussed in my review of one of the two Sanctum reprint volumes of Phantom Detective stories, the character is extraordinarily important, and like most of the big-name pulp heroes, was to say the Phantom Detective was an influence on the comics industry or just an influence on Batman. That doesn't even begin to cover how much of an influence this character and the various stories and the writers and the personnel involved were on the emerging comics industry, because comics in the golden age, to say they pulled from the pulp magazines is an understatement. There was so much taken from it that basically you wouldn't have the idea of superheroes in comics or comic books as a medium that people love and enjoy without the pulp magazines, especially in the 1930s and 40s when they were in the heyday of hero pulp characters, all spawned again by primarily by the success of The Shadow starting in 1931. But the Phantom Detective is interesting, especially when you look at it for the Batman parallels, because the Phantom Detective has the dual identity of rich playboy Curtis Van Loan, who basically devoted himself to a life of fighting crime, trained himself using his knowledge gained from traveling the world and his vast fortune, is a self-made man with no superpowers, and basically plays at being a rich playboy without a care in the world when not battling crime as the renowned Phantom Detective. Also, the Phantom Detective is a master of disguise, so there's an element of being influenced, say, by Lon Chaney Sr. as the Man of a Thousand Faces, and there's an occasional use of essentially gadgetry developed by the Phantom Detective, sometimes in his secret criminology lab, which is basically like the proto-Batcave in a lot of ways, but also he has a working relationship with the police and law enforcement, which isn't necessarily something you always see in the classic pulp characters. Usually they're on the other side of the law. But also, if that were not enough, when there is essentially a case or something to call for the Phantom Detective, and he's not merely operating on his own and even under disguise can show his little badge of identification to police officers and such, when he's needed, essentially. His compatriot in the downtown city, who's actually the publisher of the main newspaper, so it's not the police commissioner as in Batman, it's actually the head publisher of the newspaper. Anyway, they have a system developed where when the Phantom Detective is needed, there's a red beacon light atop the giant newspaper building complex, and this is what calls the Phantom Detective to action, to rush downtown and basically find out what the new case is. And this has been confirmed by various pulp historians, and also tracing the careers of the people who went from the pulp magazines into comics. This is actually the origin of the bat signal. So if you ever wondered where that whole notion came from, and also having some sort of official in and around the sort of not necessarily city government here, but at least someone high up in terms of officialdom within the downtown city itself. It comes from the Phantom Detective. It's a direct lift and reworking of the red light beacon into the bat signal. So he doesn't get mentioned very often, but when you're looking at the sort of DNA of what are the characters that most influence the Dark Knight Detective and how much of Batman's character is actually from different elements of different pulp characters, well, primarily the Shadow is the ultimate influence, as Batman basically started as a Shadow clone, and the first Batman story was essentially taken directly from a Shadow pulp novel, but there's other characters in there. So I would make the argument that at the very least, Batman at his core, in terms of the character makeup and the iconography and the personality of the character, not to mention the background, is a percentage mixture, essentially. I still don't exactly know what the percentages would be, but essentially it's mostly the Shadow, but also the Phantom and the Spider, definitely, but also a great deal of not only Doc Savage, but especially a great deal of the Phantom Detective. And since the Phantom Detective works at least somewhat within the confines of the law, there's at least less of, shall we say, a bloodlust that you would get in a Spider story, and with the focus more on detection and also being a master of disguise and being a self-made man who pretends to be a wealthy, useless playboy by day. There's so much of the flavor of a Batman story that you can very much see that in depending on who the writer was and what the story tone was, and also what the body count of the story may have been, of the classic pulp characters, the Phantom Detective is one of the ones that feels most like the Dark Knight Detective himself, and is one of the absolute primary influences on Batman. So that in and of itself is a major draw reading the Phantom Detective now, but the stories themselves are great. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that since this was a character being written over a 20-year span, there's a great variety of stories, and they were all pretty much ghost written by a variety of other authors. So depending on what the storyline was, what time the story was written in terms of what year of the monthly publication magazines, and also what sort of era of the character was this written in, you're basically going to get completely different tones and styles. And so if you read several novels back to back, they were most likely going to be ones from different times, written by different people, and you're going to get essentially different flavors. And this is no exception. So what I have here is the June 1938 issue entitled The Front Page Murders. I have to do my trailer voice. I can't resist. But we have a beautiful reproduction of a very pulp cover with, of course, the Phantom Detective and his iconic domino mask in the background looming over, as you'll see in most of the covers. So that in and of itself is classic superhero iconography DNA right there, of just the mysterious, dashing figure clad only in a domino mask, and typically you see him drawn with the sort of top hat and the sort of tuxedo look. But this is a really nice cover. I love how the gangster dual-wielding 45s and the beautiful woman are bursting out of the newspaper to tie into the title. But this book essentially revolves around a plot that is about gangsters trying to get involved with causing baseball players to throw games and trying to turn baseball itself into another part of the rackets. And of course, when the players and various baseball personnel don't comply, they turn up dead really fast. So this is very much a 1930s pulp novel in that there is a significant body count. It's more on the side of the actual gangsters than the Phantom Detective just straight up killing everybody. But there is a great deal of action, and the Phantom Detective does get his hands dirty. But there's also a nice mystery at its core, as the Phantom Detective is trying to unravel exactly who the boss of the outfit is. And nicely, there are a number of double crosses and plot twists that aren't necessarily expected. So the actual resolution of the mystery is quite solid and enjoyable. But this is very action-oriented compared to the Phantom Detective novels I've read so far. Most of them are rather action-oriented, but you can tell the ones that are more mystery-driven versus the ones that are more, we got to get more action set pieces in. This kind of leans more towards that. But you can also tell it's obviously a different writer and a different style, too, because the actual characterization of the Phantom Detective, while relatively is the same in all of these. It's also a bit different depending, I think, on who's writing the character. What's lovely here is we also have all of the beautiful original pulp illustrations scattered throughout the book, and the actual layout is copied essentially page for page, as this is a full reproduction of the original magazine. I also like how we have an attempt to recreate the actual spine with the date and everything. And then here is an illustration of the actual beacon atop the newspaper building that is signaling the Phantom Detective to come hear essentially the crime report of the new case that's emerging. The only thing, because this is not actually resetting the text and it is copying the actual pages from the magazine, as this is a replica, as is common with a lot of pulp magazines, the actual illustration is not necessarily next to where it is, where that event is taking place in the text. So sometimes you do have to keep in mind that you'll suddenly get an image on the page next to what you're reading, and it's either before or after the event you're currently reading. But the actual artwork is exceptionally well done, really beautiful renderings of mostly the action set pieces or moments of action, such as gangsters just being gunned down in the street. Of course, we have to have an image of the hero in disguise being dropped down a secret trapdoor, because what pulp story doesn't have a great trapdoor scene? You also get recreations of the little illustrations used at the start of some of the chapters. And then I love how in the Phantom Detective you occasionally get full panels like this that's essentially representing the characters involved in the mystery that is trying to be unraveled by the Phantom Detective, but with some sort of thematic connection to the story. So here the headshots are essentially like mugshots in the diamond of the baseball diamond, but the picture is basically replaced by a figure of death itself, the skeleton winding up with a pitch. It's just a beautiful image that I literally stared at this for several minutes, just going, how fantastic is this? This is one of many essentially murder attempts the Phantom Detective survives throughout this one story. Essentially, by the end of any Phantom Detective story, most actual normal people, shall we say, would be completely exhausted, barely able to move. We have another beautiful full-page panel, this time of someone who has just literally been gunned down in their office. Here, the Phantom Detective breaks into a room also in disguise. He's frequently disguised in the stories and can change his disguise at a moment's notice simply due to his expertise as being literally able to disguise himself as almost anyone and even try to imitate their voice almost perfectly. Again, that gives him the ability to sort of move through any crowd and appear and disappear at a moment's notice, which of course fits the name perfectly. You also get little small illustrations throughout, almost always in this book with the figure of death, which you also get in this chapter image. And of course, the gangsters have a secret machine gun emplacement. So again, this is the Adventure House reprint, where we have the reproduction of the entire magazine as originally published, with the short backup stories and additional features, in addition to the rather charming advertisements. So the majority of the reprint is, of course, taken up by the pulp novel, which basically runs about 80 to 90 pages, given the length. But of course, it's dual column format. But again, we have the reprinting of the Phantom Speaks column and also the background information as well that would recur in each of the magazines. So that's a really wonderful touch, in addition to the great ads. Thankfully, the actual advertisements don't necessarily creep into the text itself, which is great. You get a little bit of them popping in here and there, but mostly the text, as I've shown, is relatively clear. The ads are very charming. There's one in particular that really cracked me up, because not only was it a connection to one of my favorite serials, but the actual, just the advertisement itself just seemed quite bizarre in a way. So this is advertising Gene Rogers starring as Dale Arden in the masterpiece Flash Gordon's Trip to Mars, the second of the Flash Gordon serials. So this advertisement says, as you can clearly see, if you enjoyed Gene Rogers and Flash Gordon's Trip to Mars, buy razor blades. That's I just love how direct it is. It's just like, if you loved Flash Gordon, buy razor blades. So that's one of several ads they have for Star single-edge blades in here. But of course, you get that nice feeling of what it was like reading this magazine in 1938. You also have a short little comic section actually explaining further details and background of the Phantom Detective. And then we have two rather nice, if short, little backup stories that are well done and also have a little bit of artwork as well. And I must say, these two stories were very nicely written. So even though they are quite short, they are very well done. I just think it's a bit of a shame that a lot of the classic hero reprints don't necessarily always reprint the backup stories for each issue. Usually they just do the hero character, so it's nice when somebody's able to do both. In the end of the book, when you've got the backup stories, you have a lot more of the advertisements, so this is what a typical page can look like, but thankfully the actual main novel is never this cluttered. You can also see the wonderful variety of advertisements and how it was worded. So there's again such great charm of actually looking closely and reading the vintage ads. And then we close with another one that's just I love the "to men without rich uncles." It's such an attention grabbing kind of strange attempt to grab the eye, but it certainly does. So again, this reproduces the original novel, and then the rear is basically the standard Adventure House style. So this is what you should expect when you pick up one of the lovely Adventure House reprints of the Phantom Detective, and also their other Pulp magazine reprints. Again, this is the June 1938 issue, and it does compare rather favorably to the two novels that I read in the Sanctum reprint. This being June 1938, it kind of comes in between those two in terms of the actual publication date. So this is almost a sort of in between in terms of tone compared to those two, with one novel being more mystery oriented and the other being much more action oriented, as I covered in my review. This is kind of a bit of both, so it shows how the character could be modulated a little bit differently, and kind of was at this point. So this is essentially what you should expect in terms of the overall style and reprint quality when you pick up one of the Adventure House Phantom Detective reprints or any of their other Pulp reprints that are doing the full magazine size reproduction. Again, this seems to be a really nice scan of an original issue. The text is really well reproduced and a nice printing compared to what you see in some Pulp reprints. It's just not as fancy, shall we say, as the Sanctum volume, which has the lovely historical essays and also gives you two novels in one, plus this one actually had a reprint of a Phantom Detective comic. But this also goes for the resetting of the text to make it all nice and clean, and also does essentially some restoration work on all of the art to just make it look as good as it can be. But again, the real draw is also the beautiful essays in between and at the end of each, plus the supplemental material. This doesn't really have supplemental material outside of this. Actually reproduces the whole magazine and gives you the backup issues plus the vintage ads. So Sanctum only did 2 volumes of Phantom Detective, but Adventure House has done, I think, most of the entire run. So the Adventure House reprints are the one method you have of building a set of replicas and reprints of most of the entirety of the Phantom Detective pulp novels. So those are my thoughts on reading the June 1938 issue of the Phantom Detective, the front page murders contained in this lovely and very affordable Adventure House reprint and replica of the original magazine. The Phantom Detective is one of the truly important pulp characters, and I just feel anytime I read a classic pulp story or a pulp magazine or a replica or something, especially dealing with the big important hero characters, I feel it's important to cover it in great detail, because these works and these characters are so important, and without them, much of the current pop culture landscape not only would be different, it simply wouldn't exist. I don't think it's a stretch to say that comic books as we know them, particularly in terms of hero characters, wouldn't exist without the pulp magazines, and took so much from the pulp magazines that it's really the pulp magazines that are the heart and core of what we think of in terms of comics. So these works are incredibly important, and they don't get the respect and attention they deserve. It's only due to individual efforts and publishers and reprint houses really fighting the good fight and carrying on this work. So if you're at all interested, I strongly recommend you check out Adventure House's website. Their store is very easy to navigate, and you can actually pick up a lot of their Phantom Detective reprints that are still available. They're not super expensive. Their list price is usually only about $15 or $13, depending on which issue you get. So you can try one or two and see if you enjoy the experience. And trust me, you most likely will. And then you might decide to pick up some more or try to track down the really fancy but sadly out of print 2 Sanctum volumes as well. So as always, I hope my babbles about classic pulp characters and pulp fiction and pulp magazines has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, without these characters, what you think of in terms of comic books simply wouldn't exist. And the Phantom Detective as a character himself is an enormous influence on really a lot of 20th century detective characters, but especially if you had to focus on one character, the Phantom Detective is an enormous influence on Batman, without whom a number of Batman's most famous character traits wouldn't exist, as they were very much taken directly from the Phantom Detective. So even just for Batman fans, it is incredibly important to not only have a knowledge, but have some experience reading the Phantom Detective in the classic pulp magazine stories. So as always, please keep supporting independent publishers and bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some lovely pulp reprints. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.